Trovati. Greetings from Rome. My name is Silvia Dall'Olio and I serve as the Executive Director of the Rome Global Gateway. We're excited to welcome you back to the third appointment with our Rome Book Club Journey to Italy, Viaggio in Italia. This series is titled A Hell of a City, Dante's Inferno on the Road to Rome, and it is led by Professors Cachey, David Lummus, and Chiara Sbordoni. Before we dive into Canto 13 of the Inferno, please allow me to mention briefly that today is a special day in Italy and in Europe as we celebrate the International Holocaust Remembrance Day. As Rome Gateway, we participate in the commemorations in a especially heartfelt way, given our special engagement with the history of the Jewish presence in Rome. One of the reasons why we have developed a special relationship with the Jewish community in the city is the fact that the building that is now our student residence is in Rome in the years 1938, 1940 was utilized by the community as a school for the Jewish students and teachers who were expelled from the Italian public schools because of the racial laws that the fascist regime promulgated in 1938. Professor Sbordoni, who's with us today, has always been very active in promoting lectures and conferences in collaboration with the Jewish community in Rome. And I thought that it would be important to mention this connection on a day like today before we came back to our beloved Dante. So here we go. Last week, we read Canto 5 of Dante's Inferno and talked about lust and its punishment. We encountered the two protagonists of the canto, Paolo and Francesca, who fell in love reading love literature. We discussed Dante the Pilgrim and Dante the author's perspectives on Francesca's story. If you missed last week's discussion, you can view the event on the Think ND YouTube channel. Today, our experts will take us through the wood of suicides of Inferno 13, and I'm really looking forward to listening to the conversation. Before that, a word of gratitude to our co-sponsors of the Journey to Italy Rome Book Club, the Rome Global Gateway, Notre Dame International, the Center for Italian Studies, and the Notre Dame Alumni Association, and of course, all the team members that make this event possible. Our current number of registration is at more than 440 people, representing participants from 10 countries worldwide. As always, if you have questions for the three faculty members, please use the Google form that we're sharing with you now. We will also have a private moderated discussion board on LinkedIn to continue the discussion after the Zoom conversation. The link to that discussion board is being shared with you right now. Now, without any further ado, I welcome Professor Cachey and Professor David Lummus from the Center for Italian Studies on campus, and Professor Chiara Sbordoni from the Rome Global Gateway, who will take it from here. Thank you.
Thank you, Sylvia, and thank you for this collaboration. I'm glad you mentioned the Remembrance Day. It gives me the opportunity to introduce another Italian author, Primo Levi, who together with Dante is perhaps one of the most important contributions or contributors to world literature from Italy. Primo Levi was an Italian Jewish chemist, partisan, Holocaust survivor, and writer. He lived between 1919 and 1987. He's famous for several books, but the best known is called If This Is a Man, was also published as Survival in Auschwitz in the United States. And this is his account of the year he spent as a prisoner in the Auschwitz concentration camp in Nazi-occupied Poland. And it would be, Levi would be a great subject, Sylvia, I think, for another book club in due course. And of course, he had a very conflicted, as you might expect, relationship with Dante, which is a subject of a lot of scholarly discussion and debate currently. But that's a little book club recommendation to get us going today. As is our wont, we begin with some questions left from our last meeting. Two very challenging and important questions. The first one came up in my community circle last week, and the second one comes from Rome. The first, why did Dante write the book? Which is a stunning and important question, obviously, and related, very much related to that, is the question of who is he writing for? An everyday people, an intellectual elite? What to Dante would have been success for his poem? So these are obviously very large questions, but we thought we'd spend just a few minutes. And I'm going to pass the hot potato to David and Chiara to start.
Well, I'll tell you, I mean, that's a really difficult series of questions. I guess why does anybody write anything? I think Dante must have written it, above all for himself. I think that the book can be read in a lot of ways as a self-interrogation of finding himself in the world. So it's a way of rooting himself in somewhere in some time in a way that was meaningful, that after his exile. Some people, I think, that he wrote it in Florence or started it in Florence, like Boccaccio, for example, and even scholars today think that he may have started it in Florence. That would kind of influence our answer to who he wrote it for. Boccaccio says he wrote it for the good of the citizens of Florence. Is that right? I don't know. I think he wrote it for the future. At a certain point in the poem, he kept writing it for the future. So that's my take.
Chiara?
Thank you, David and Ted. I would like to, as a possible answer to why did Dante write the book, quote his own letter to Cangrande when he writes that the purpose of the whole and the part could be multiple, that is both remote and proximate. But leaving off subtle investigation, we can say briefly that the purpose of the whole as well as the part is to remove those living in this life from the state of misery and to lead them to the state of bliss.
That's very clear, and I think
she's so cute.
That's a very strong motivation, and that's what we can hope for in our reading. His audience, I think, is also addressed in one of his other works, however, the Convivio, the banquet, the work that he wrote before the exile. And there he wrote one of the aspects of the banquet that's so important is his defense and his argument in favor of the use of the vernacular language instead of Latin, which was the common language of the intelligentsia at the time that Dante was writing. So it was a very revolutionary step to write the poem in Italian. And that tells us a lot about the audience. I think his audience went beyond the Latinate intelligentsia, the professors in the universities or the clergy in the church. And in fact, he writes that he describes his audience in the Convivio as noble persons comprising princes, barons, knights, and many other noble people, not only men, but women. Dante was writing for women, which was another explicit audience, which is quite an important dimension, I think, of his self-definition, of which there are many in this language who know only the vernacular and are not learned in Latin. So in a very synthetic way, I think already in the banquet, in the Convivio, he's addressing an audience which is all of the community, because all of the community needs the knowledge, needs to be brought in this life from the state of misery to a state of bliss. It's not limited to the intelligentsia or the clergy, we can say. And this question is such an important question that in the 1990s, several of the most important Dantists in the United States actually wrote brief essays in response to the question, why did Dante write the comedy? And so it's a question that I think is constantly being addressed and has been addressed by many. It's something that we need to reflect on as we continue our reading. And we'll make available these articles by some of the leading Dantists in the United States, Mazzotta, Barolini, Joan Ferrante, and of course, Hollander, the editor of our and translator of the poem that we have been depending upon, wrote very interesting responses to this question, which we'll share in the on the site after today's meeting. I want to move on to our first question, and let me just read briefly the prelude of Inferno 13. Nessus had not yet reached the other side when we made our way into a forest not marked by any path. No green leaves, but those of dusky hue, not a straight branch, but knotted and contorted. No fruit of any kind, but poisonous thorns. No rougher, denser thickets make a refuge for the wild beasts that hate tilled lands between the Cecina and Corneto. Here the filthy harpies nest, who drove the Trojans from the Strophides with doleful prophecies of woe to come. They have broad wings, human necks and faces, taloned feet, and feathers on their bulging bellies. Their wailing fills the eerie trees. Where are we located? What is the sin? And can we have an account of the contrapasso? How are the landscape and the sin appropriate to one another? Chiara, do you want to lead us in that?
Yes, thanks, Ted. So Dante and Virgil now are in the seventh circle of hell, the circle of violence, and precisely in the second ring, where the violence against self are punished, so the suicides and also the squanderers. The environments of the seventh circle in general are all natural settings in the sense of a perverted nature, including the river of blood, the sticks of the violence against others in Canto 12, the wood of suicides in Canto 13, where we are now, and the barren desert upon which falls flakes of flame of the sodomites in Cantos 15, 16, and 17. The harpies who feed on the branches, like the centaurs who guard the violence against others, are mythological beasts who combine human and animal attributes. The hybridity of the human and animal natures of the guardians reflects the hybridity of the sins of violence, which express the animalistic dimension of human identity. So let's take the filthy harpies at verses 13, 15 that Ted has just read. They have broad wings, human necks and faces, taloned feet and feathers on their bulging bellies. Their wailing fills the eerie trees. So the punishments or contrapasso of the suicides that they are transformed into monstrous narrow trees signifies the degradation of human identity to the lowest level on the chain of living being. So we once were men and now are turned to thorns, at line 37. That is, the human intellect is distinctive of the highest attribute of humans who also have an animal and vegetable natures according to a classical Aristotelian anthropology, which viewed mankind as combining vegetable, animal, and human dimensions of identity. But the contorted form of the wood so is defined here by antithesis. Again, in the first lines, 4 through 6, no green leaves, but those of dusky hue, not a straight branch, but knotted and contorted, and no fruit of any kind, but poisonous thorns. Maybe some of you have read the article by Leo Spitzer, which was in the additional resources that insists on this rhetoric and the qualities of the suicidal mind so contorted as to deny itself life, and also the feelings of Dante the character confronted with this landscape and punishment. And also the imagery of breaking and tearing that characterizes the canto relates to the violent interruption of the link between body and soul that the act of suicide affects. And for instance, another important thing, speaking of this completely disconnection and breakage of the link between body and soul. The suicides are the only damned souls who won't regain their bodies at the end of times. So their bodies instead will be hung as empty carcasses to the eerie trees where the souls will be eternally trapped, as Pier himself explains at lines 103, 108, where he says, "We will come to claim our cast of bodies like the others, but it would not be just if we again put on the flesh we robbed from our own souls. Here shall we drag it, and in this dismal wood our bodies will be hung, each one upon the thorn bush of its painful shade." This said, we received two excellent questions that today from Bloomfield Hills, Michigan, which are connected to the contrapasso of Canto 13. One asks if do the thorn bushes weep blood because their roots, given the location of the thorn bushes, would have been able to draw blood from the river Phlegethon. And I was thinking that as much as the proximity to the river of blood would make this perhaps possible, the thorn bushes actually weep blood because the souls were turned into thorn bushes completely. So the souls are not inside, they are the thorn bushes, and the blood represents somehow the lymph of these souls who suffer a form of torture when a part of them is broken or detached. And then we have another excellent question, again from the same participant. Today's gospel, Mark 4, 1 to 20, on faith and D, is about the sower and the seed, and could not be more timely given our focus on Inferno 13. In line 32, Pier delle Vigne is described as a great thorn bush. Would you agree that Dante, the author, is depicting Pier as one who not only receives the seed on rocky ground, because when persecution came, he committed suicide, but also one who receives the seed among the thorns, because Pierre's concern and desire for power, riches, and other things choked the word, and it was unfruitful. I don't know if Ted or David have comments on this second question, which seems excellent to me because it's excellent to link this contrapasso in response to the parable of the sower and the seed, especially in the sort of explanation that Christ gives to his apostles after recounting the parable. I don't know if.
Thank you, Chiara. That's a wonderful discussion, and I think we can give Bloomfield Hills an A in the seminar for this week on their participation grade, because it's absolutely spot on, as we say. The theme of the canto is about faith and belief. I think it's a recurring motif that we'll have occasion to continue to speak about. But that's exactly the kind of interaction that Dante establishes between the Bible and the New Testament and his text throughout the poem, and including the Inferno. So that's the reader is learning how to read Dante. That's a great insight, really, into the way that Dante is signifying in this poem by putting himself into direct relation with the biblical text. I want to turn to David with the next question and thank him for his excellent video. I hope you had a chance to view it on this question, but if he has more to add about the allusions to Virgil's Aeneid in the first part of this canto, which are so pronounced, what can we make of them singly and taken together? David?
Well, I think with specific regard to the Polydorus intertext, which is the the foundation of the punishment and the speaking of Pier delle Vigne through the branch, through the blood gurgling up, which comes straight out of the Aeneid, is related to the comment that you just made about faith and belief. And we can compare a few lines If you look at lines 20 through 22, where Virgil tells the pilgrim, "Look well, you will see things that in my telling would seem to strip my words of truth." And so if you compare that, so basically he's telling the pilgrim, you know, to examine what he sees, and then he has to recommend to the pilgrim, you have to break the branch to make them speak. And then later on, if you go to 46, line 46 and on, where Virgil apologizes to Pier delle Vigne, he says, "Could he have believed it otherwise, O wounded soul? What he has seen only in my verses, he would have raised his hand against. He would not have raised his hand against you." And so what you have here is, it's an interesting kind of juxtaposition of Dante the poet playing with Dante the pilgrim, right? So the pilgrim doesn't believe what he's read in the Aeneid. Had he believed what he had read in the Aeneid, that branches can speak, then he wouldn't have needed the proof that comes with actually doing the thing that causes the other person, this other soul, pain. And so since the pilgrim didn't believe in the Aeneid, Dante sort of stages this interaction with about faith in the literary text, right? And I think it's been pointed out by several critics that, you know, what Dante is suggesting kind of in between the lines is that we as readers of his text need to behave differently than the pilgrim. We need to believe in the truth of his text so that we don't go out and you know, read like Francesca, for example, right? We don't go out and read surface level meaning and misunderstand things. Okay, so he's telling us we need to engage with the text in a different way, right? And so it's Dante's really, in a way that's kind of parallel to Francesca. The Francesca episode, you know, he's teaching us how to read. He's making us aware of what we need to get out of the act of reading, right? And
to put our belief and our faith in Dante's text, you know, by
right.
implication, as you're suggesting. Chiara, do you want to add to that?
Just possibly that Dante keeps mapping his own journey through hell, or the character's journey through hell, against Aeneas's journey. And connected.
So just as Aeneas encounters Dido on his journey, and he encounters Polydorus on his journey, exactly. Dante's kind of recapitulating the different stages of a journey. Where is it going? To Italy, to Rome. And these are the hazards that Dante encounters along Dante the pilgrim, but also Dante the poet in many senses along the way. I'm sorry, I interrupted you, Chiara.
No, I thought that also this part was well connected to our next question 3, that I'd like to address to you, which is about how lines 22 through 27 describing Dante's state of mind reflective of his personal situation in the context.
Well, there's something that's lost in translation here. Thank you for asking. Where you look at line 24, Hollander translates it as, "So that confused I stopped." Whereas if you look at the Italian, he actually says, "Perché io tutto smarrito mi arrestai." And smarrito is exactly the same word from the first canto, the first line of Inferno 1. And so Dante is returning us to his own wood. He's drawing a very clear connection between the wood of Pier delle Vigne, the wood of suicide, and his own situation at the beginning of the poem. And so there's I think, a very strong autobiographical suggestion here. Some would say that Dante indeed is reflecting on his own suicidal thought pattern in response to his existential and exilic state in this episode with Pier delle Vigne. There's all kinds of interesting identifications with Pier delle Vigne that are going on in this canto. And this marito is, it's also an opportunity to point out one of Dante's techniques. I would call it verbal figuralism. That is, he will use the same word limited number of times in contexts which are insight giving and to be interpreted in relation to one another. And selva, or the wood, is one of those terms, because at the beginning of the poem, we're in the selva oscura, but at the end of the Purgatorio, we're in the divine forest of earthly Eden, which he calls the selva. This marito is also a theme that's picked up numerous times. We've already seen it in, you'll remember in Paolo and Francesca, when he sees the list of the knights and ladies of old, and he is quasi smarito. So I just wanted to point out that particular bit of verbal figuralism. And then I love this, I think he thought that I thought, which is beautiful in Italian, credio che credete che io credesse, which is communicating to us. I think it's foreshadowing the confused, bewildered mind of the suicidal psychology from the perspective of Dante himself. He's being absorbed or immersed in this environment, and he doesn't know where the voices are coming from. And he's setting up what we're going to see shortly in the confused psychology of Pier delle Vigne. I think I'm moving forward. Question 4, I think we need to say something about who is Pier delle Vigne. And again, thank you, Chiara, for your excellent video on this theme, but maybe you could recapitulate. I mean, who is this guy? Why is he important? What is Dante? Why is Dante so engaged by him?
Thanks, Ted. Yes, Pier was Frederick's chancellor. He had made a very quick career progression at the Magna Curia, which was the political and administrative and juridical center of the Kingdom of Sicily, the court of Frederick II, who was the King of Sicily, but also the Holy Roman Emperor. Pier had been appointed notary and chancellor in 1220. Then he had been nominated judge of the Magna Curia in 1225, and then chancellor of the imperial court in 1239. And in 1247, logothete, which was a senior administrative title coming from the Byzantine tradition and corresponding to that of a secretary of state, and protonotary, so the chief of the court of law of the Magna Curia, of the court of Frederick II. He had, for instance, contributed to the composition of the Liber Augustalis, a collection of 200 laws called the Constitutiones Regni Siciliae, or the constitutions of the Kingdom of Sicily, that was considered the most advanced code of laws produced by a secular power during the Middle Ages. So when he was right at the top of his career in 1249, Pier was accused, according to Dante, by envious courtiers of betraying Frederick. And note that Dante's contempt of envy as one of the roots of all evils is a theme throughout the poem. Most historians contemporary to Pier regarded this accusation as slander. And Pier was imprisoned, he was blinded, and he killed himself banging his head against the walls of his cell. So on the one hand, Dante recognizes the stature of Pier and exonerates him of the charge of treason. Now, I think it's worth noting that Dante the Exile's identification with the disgraced political figure of Pier delle Vigne. We will talk more about it in a moment, but I'd like to consider Dante's operation in this canto from the perspective of a contemporary readership to Dante, which would have been uncertain actually about Pier delle Vigne's guilt or innocence. So Dante writes the poem in such a way as to assume authority over questions that did engage controversy at the time he was writing. So posing himself as an authority.
Mm-hmm. Go ahead, Chiara. I'm sorry. Did you have something else?
No, that's it.
Wonderful. David, did you want to say something?
Yeah, sure. I mean, I thought that, connected to what you were saying earlier about Dante's state of mind. I think it's, you know, in the fact that his forest is like his initial forest is linked, you know, philologically really with the forest, with Pier delle Vigne's forest, the forest of the suicides. I mean, it makes us, and these other connections of Dante's personal life, he's exiled because he betrayed the state and everything, and because of envy, he thinks as well, right? You know, there are all these parallels between Pier delle Vigne and Dante's own situation. It makes one ask, I mean, is Dante working through, I mean, if you want to take it from a kind of non-philological, psychological point of view, I mean, is Dante working through his own, I don't know, sort of thoughts about his, you know, self-harm and things like that? You know, is this his own, I think, connected to what I was saying earlier about what he may have written this, you know, also for himself as a way of working through his own position in the world? You know, do these parallels make us, can they, you know, act as evidence for, you know, Dante's own psychological state of mind as he's writing the Infernos, that he's somehow linked up with the suicide in a very profound way, I think. And
he's exercising from himself this error, this sin.
Yeah.
And it's also very much letting us know how it's about the political world. It's about Dante's exile. And Dante, like Pier delle Vigne, is entrapped and trauma and undergoing a kind of trauma due to his political activities and the violence and difficulties of the political world. So that's very much a part of this. I mean, of course, as implicit in what Chiara was saying is that, of course, the Holy Roman Emperor was against the Pope and Pope Boniface VIII. I mean, we'll talk more about this next week, but the whole dispute between the empire and the church is the general background for the corruption of society, the crisis of the contemporary world in Dante's mind. And so he's really at the neuralgic. This is a very neuralgic node, so to speak, in the journey of the Inferno with respect to the political world. I want to hear Chiara read the moving speech in Italian so that we can hear the language of Dante. We'll have the facing page on the side. And then David, maybe you could get us started on the, you know, what's wrong with this picture. There's so much we can comment on in this passage. Chiara, would you like to read for us, please?
Sure. Okay, so. Il tronco.
Can you put it up, Chiara? Did you put up the text? I'm sorry.
You're right. I thought I'd done it, but I haven't. Okay, can you see it? Okay.
Yep.
Il tronco, sì col dolce dir madeschi, ch'io non posso tacere, e voi non gravi, perch'io un poco a ragionarmi inveschi. Io son colui che tenne ambo le chiavi del cor di Federigo e che le volsi, serrando e disserrando, sì soavi che dal secreto suo quasi ognuno tolsi. Fede portai al glorioso uffizio, tanto chi ne perdei i sogni e i polsi. La meretrice che mai dall'ospizio di Cesare non torse gli occhi putti, morte comune e delle corti vizio, infiammò contra me gli animi tutti, e l'infiammati infiammarsi Augusto, che lieti onor tornaro in tristi lutti. L'animo mio, per disdegnoso gusto, credendo col morir fuggir disdegno, ingiusto fece me contra me giusto. Per le 9 radici d'esto legno, vi giuro, che giammai non ruppi fede al mio Signore, che fu d'onor sì degno. E se di voi alcuna il mondo riede, conforti la memoria mia che giace ancor del colpo che invidia le diede.
All right. Thank you, Chiara. To get us started, I mean, I think, you know, we should have in mind also Francesca's speech, which was as we mentioned, a masterpiece of, on the one hand, a kind of self-delusional exculpation. It's not my fault. Love made me do it. The writer of the book made me do it. For Francesca, and here, Pier delle Vigne, is blaming everything on envy and on the court and all of the political machinations that are going on, and it's not his fault, right? It's not. He pleads innocent, just like Francesca did. And I think, so you have that on the one hand, just like you do with Francesca. In the same way as Francesca also is able to escape her own punishment through her own speech. Like she gains a kind of great spiritedness, like she gains, which the Romantics just loved, right? And the same thing with Pier delle Vigne also sort of embodies this, this greatness of soul, I suppose you could say. He's not exactly magnanimous, but he's escapes the simplicity, the kind of the banality of his own sin, I think, right? So he has a certain dignity that that not all sinners, I think, in hell do. And I think that from his speech we can see that Dante is also projecting himself to a certain extent onto this desire to say it's not my fault, right? Not to accept responsibility for what's happened to him, right? So.
Going back, David, to something we were talking about earlier, this theme of faith and belief. Mm-hmm. I just want to notice how it's picked up, as you say, philologically or very precisely in the terms and the terminology. If you look at line 62, Pier protests, "So faithful was I to that glorious office." And in verse 70, he says, "Credendo col morir fuggir disdegno." Again, you miss in the translation. Mm-hmm. How does he do it? He says, hoping by dying. He actually says, credere, credendo. It's going back to that issue of faith and belief. And I think Dante's examining in the canto different forms of faith and belief. And I think as readers, we're supposed to say, well, what's wrong with this picture? Faith in what? Belief in what? And I think we're supposed to see that Pier is making he's missing something when he says, for example, when he protests that I never broke faith, lines 74 and 75, I never broke faith with my true Lord. I think that there's no way that Dante doesn't want us as readers to recognize the irony in that. Faith in Frederick II, who, by the way, Dante has condemned to among the heretics in Inferno 10, vis-a-vis faith in the true Lord, in God Almighty. Chiara, do you have something to add? Well, there's so much.
There's so much to say. On the one hand, what always strikes me reading this canti, it was last week with Francesca and this time with Pier, and I mean, David was noting it too, that these characters are presented as basically the quintessence of the beauty and of the values and virtues promoted by Dante's cultural milieu, cultural society, and by the literature. Like Francesca can be taken as the example of the heroine of courtly love, as Pier is presented like the quintessence of the successful politician and administrator. And it's one of the guises in which evil presents itself. And it's, again, a way of inviting the reader to read beyond the surface, beyond the beauty. I mean, it's striking how Francesca insists on the bella forma, her beauty and the beauty of Paolo, and how here other characteristics of greatness are underscored continuously, but we know that ultimately these people here are condemned forever, so there's no redemption. And so this is what really sometimes strikes me as one of the powerful ways in which Dante is telling the reader, don't be seduced by what seems to be perfectly aligned to the common codes. Evil is evil.
I think here too, and those of you who were able to read the Spitzer article, I think he starts to say this, but I think it needs to be said more fully, is that, so Pier delle Vigne is like the Henry Kissinger, or the, we're talking about the highest level of intellect and rhetoric and diplomacy in the world at that time. And so his speech, and we could go through all of the rhetorical figures, the personifications, the juxtapositionings, the rhetoric of high rhetoric. Dante's turning that rhetoric and turning it into a portrait of a distorted mind that is as distorted as those trees that we encountered at the beginning of the canto. The special vice of courts, 67 and following, inflamed all minds against me, and they did so inflame Augustus. Okay, that's one thing. But then, hoping my scornful temper, and temper, what's temper? It's intellect and body. Here in that one word, you get he says in the Italian, disdegnoso gusto. In other words, it's a bodily rage, anger, violence, which is of the intellect, but also of the animal nature, of the body, made me, though just, against myself unjust. Okay, so I think we're supposed to see, like, credio, che credete, there's a bewilderment in the psychology of the subject here that I think we're supposed to understand as part of the problem. Part of Dante's diagnosis of the suicidal psychology. Why don't we turn to, again, as you see in our meetings, we keep coming back to the same method, the same approach to reading the Inferno that can be extended beyond just a few examples that we can discuss together. Again, we have to ask ourselves, though, so what's the attitude of the poet? What's the attitude of the pilgrim? And how is Dante manipulating the reader, or manipulating, in playing those two things off against one another? Who's up? Do you want to take it, David, or Chiara?
I think Chiara, did you want to go?
Chiara, you're up for that?
Sorry.
What's Dante's attitude toward Pier delle Vigne, the pilgrims versus the poet?
So, again, I think that the Dante, the character, as last week we have seen him completely swamped by Francesca's rhetoric and account on and how that resonated with part of his past, of his experience as a lover and as a poet of love during his youth. Here, the pilgrim is again identifies himself with Pier delle Vigne, and again he is sort of won by pity for him. He says at some point that he can't ask his, when Virgil invites him to ask another question after Pierre's speech, Dante the pilgrim says, please, you question him, because I can't, I'm so, pity fills my heart and I can't really talk. So the pilgrim, of course, identifies with Pierre because of his personal history. We had said, Ted last week spoke about the political career and exile of Dante, how in January 1302 he had been banned from Florence for 2 years, accused of being corrupt and not being loyal to his city while he was in Rome, probably. And we'll get back to this next week. And because he decided not to go in front of the judge to trial, he was then banned in perpetuity from Florence. So he went to exile. So again, Dante the Pilgrim in front of Pier is overwhelmed, and he completely identifies with the character. On the other hand, we have already said how Dante the poet shows the reader how Pier delle Vigne's rhetoric denounces the sinner's lack of consciousness of his own state, which is an irredeemable state. In a sense, Pierre's speech, in which he, in the context of God's justice, he's preoccupied with rehabilitating himself vis-a-vis his loyalty to Frederick, is completely, I mean, he misses the point. He's in hell. He's still attached to the accusation he has suffered, and he misses the point that.
That's well said. Mm-hmm. No, that's very well said. Yeah, thank you. David, you want to pitch in?
Yeah, sure. I mean, to pick up on some of the things that Chiara said, that, if we look at, if we think of the Inferno, and I don't think necessarily we should, as a kind of theater of crime and punishment, right? That, the pilgrims looking, we're looking, and, that's one of the reasons the Inferno is so popular, is because it's so spectacular in a lot of ways, right? But, if we look at the reaction of the pilgrim, which starts off as marvel, right? He's confused, he doesn't know what he's seeing. Then he listens and he observes and he feels pity, and then basically, he arrives at a kind of, the point that Chiara made about the connection between the pity and the exoneration that the poet gives to Pier delle Vigne for his crime of treason, right? And so it moves from marvel to pity to forgiveness. I think that is through the process of recognizing and understanding that Pier delle Vigne wasn't able to arrive at. Through the reading of the poem, through poetry, we're able, as readers, to go through a similar process to the pilgrim and, arrive at pity and forgiveness through the kind of marvel that the poem engenders in us as readers. And I think that's just something I thought we could.
That's well said. It's tricky, he actually exonerates, as you said, for all of, everybody's out there, his readership, they're wondering, well, Pier delle Vigne, was he a traitor or not? Right. Well, Dante has come back from the afterlife to inform us all that, in fact, Pier delle Vigne, he was innocent. But at the same time, he's putting him in hell for the suicide. So it's like very, very tricky, that Dante, very interesting irony there. And we have a minute before we turn to the questions. I just wanted to kind of free associate on, at the conclusion of our discussion amongst ourselves. He mentions Minos in the at verse 96. It's Minos who condemns Pier delle Vigne to the seventh gulch, which reminds me of something that I wanted to say last week, and I feel it might be appropriate to say it now. We had a lot of strong discussion and feedback on, Dante's so hard on Francesca, it seems. Where does Dante get off putting all these people in hell? This kind of relates to the question that we had at the beginning of our discussions about Dante's pride. Where does he get off, doing this? How can we accept the viciousness of, he puts his enemies in hell, starting with Boniface VIII. Where's the justice in that? I think these are questions that we're supposed to ask. And I just wanted to suggest, I thought that, and this is very personal, I don't know if I haven't had a chance to try this out on David and Chiara, but do you remember in Canto 5, he starts out with the representation of Minos as this severe judge. You know, Minos is putting these people where they belong in hell. And then in the same Canto 5, he's the confessor. He's kind of like the false confessor. And then later in Canto 5, there's a point, if you recall, where the pilgrim says, "Oh, tell me more, Francesca." In other words, Dante the pilgrim assumes the role or the attitude of the confessor. He's kind of like, there's a kind of mirroring effect between the representation of Minos at the beginning and the representation of Dante in his, you know, tell me more, tell me more. He's the confessor of Francesca. And in my opinion, I think Dante does that stuff on purpose, that he's calling attention to us between the lines. He's stepping back a bit, you know. He's recognizing that, you know, Dante is the author of this hell at one level. And if you know, see what you think, I think as you read the poem, I think it's a very interesting and important dimension to recognize, and it kind of nuances the judgments of Dante's hell. It kind of helps us to see that Dante is not just this vindictive, you know, it's not just all about that, the theater of horrors. Chiara, do we have, or David, who has the questions? Let's see if we can take 5 minutes and address some of the questions that have come in. You're laughing, Chiara. You don't agree with that opinion of mine.
No. No, I was just thinking that these damn souls don't have, I mean, it's not time for confession anymore and for repenting anymore. So I agree that's a parody, and that's I don't know, David, do you have any questions or?
Have we had some questions come in?
Do you see one, Chiara? I'm trying to figure out which ones we have answered already. And,
you had one, Chiara, I thought this morning that we didn't address.
Well, here's one. You're going to, the one from Maynard, Massachusetts. And it asks if Dante's Inferno influenced church teaching on suicide, and did it influence Christian beliefs about hell in general? And I don't know if it I don't think it influenced church teachings on suicide, but I think it does reflect, I think, you know, some the you know, like Augustinian ideas about suicide, say from the first book of the City of God, when St. Augustine speaks about the suicide of Lucretia and the women of Rome who are considering or committing suicide because they've been raped during the sacking of Rome. And he says that they shouldn't do so because, you know, they were innocent, and so you shouldn't kill an innocent person. And he has an interesting reading of the story of Lucretia, which is that that her suicide implies that she may have been guilty of adultery, right? And so I think Dante has that kind of mentality in the back of his mind, but I'm not sure if he has influenced very much the church teachings on suicide, and whether or not he influenced Christian beliefs about hell. I mean, he certainly helped us visualize things such as limbo, but also purgatory. I mean, he's one of the most influential writers about purgatory and as a place. So being one of the first to write about that. Ted, I don't know if you wanted to jump in, or Chiara, on that question.
I mean, I think the relationship between Dante's poem and the theology of his time is one of the most important and exhaustingly discussed topics, and it's extremely complex to try to relate Dante to all of the authorities of the church fathers and the biblical exegetes, and it's a very interesting division, we might say, of Dante studies, is to try to understand where Dante is positioning himself with respect to the beliefs, the belief system. I think David makes the key point, though. I think Dante makes the theology real. He makes it, we experience it in the interactions between the sinners and hell. We experience it as a place in his description of hell. He makes it a reality in a way that is without precedent. And also, as David pointed out, purgatory was a Christian theological concept that was relatively recent, from the 13th century, from the beginning of the 13th century, or, there's a lot of controversy about these questions, but for those of you who are interested in it, there's a very famous book by Jacques Le Goff called The Birth of Purgatory. And the last chapter, as I recall, it's been a while since I've looked at it, is all completely dedicated to Dante. And he makes the point that what had been a fairly incipient or nascent theological understanding of this place between the death of the blessed and their eventual arrival in paradise, Dante turns it into a reality, the 7 steps of purgatory. It becomes a commonplace and a real lived experience of the faithful in response to Dante's writing of the poem. So that would be my, a starting point to answer that very interesting question. Chiara, do you want to add anything?
I agree with what both you and David have said, that we can look at the question both ways, starting from the influence of theologians, contemporary theologians on Dante. David was, Christian theologians on Dante. David was speaking of St. Augustine. I was thinking of Thomas Aquinas and his doctrines on and his theology on suicide. And at the same time, Dante contributed to our, to make it concrete, as you were saying, and to our imagery. And also, I was thinking that Dante was profoundly influenced by the imagery of hell, and that he would see in contemporary visual arts, for instance. So there's, I guess, and like that illustrated inside the churches and basilicas, the theology in visual images. So, and reconstructing all these relationships between all these different fields is one of the mainstream of Dante studies nowadays, I believe.
Yeah, one thing about the one point that should be made about the theology is that Dante, what we understand now based on the scholarship, is that Dante is not simply illustrating or imitating or following theology. He himself is a theologian as a poet. And a lot of the most advanced scholarship is trying to understand Dante's poetics and his poem as a kind of theological poetry, as a poetry that has its own perspective and its own position, both with respect to the theology and the theological debates that were taking place at Dante's time, but also in terms of contemporary theology. And since we were talking about authors earlier, one of our colleagues who has gone on to the King's College at the University in the United Kingdom, but who was with us at Notre Dame for several years, Vittorio Montemaggi, is one of the leaders of the theologians who are reading Dante today in relation to contemporary theology and contemporary interreligious issues that are reflected and that relate to Dante's text. I'm just going to look over my shoulder and give you the title of his book. Reading Dante's Commedia as Theology. Very, very interesting and very contemporary theological reflections on the relevance of Dante's poem in the theological sphere. I fear we've gone over time. I'm sorry. Sylvia, do you want to give us a goodbye, an envoy?
Well, it's always great to go over time when these kind of topics are discussed. Also such articulate, so thank you, great. Thank you also to everyone for participating today and for sharing this series with your friends and family if you so desire. We're now ready to start the community circle or breakout rooms. We will remain into the breakout rooms for 15 minutes. I invite you to discuss 2 questions that our faculty suggested, and before you do so, to introduce yourself if you so desire. The questions are, what is your reaction to Pier delle Vigne's story and to the wood of the suicides of Inferno 13? And do you have any comments on the interaction between Dante the Pilgrim and Pier delle Vigne? So please note that each room will have one of our faculty in it, and we expect that we all follow the rules of civil discourse and that you will respect each other's comments. Please note that if you choose not to participate in the breakout rooms, you may leave the meeting now and join us next week.